"You're nothing but a petty, thieving piece of garbage," the police chief snarled, his hand pinning the woman of color's head down onto the scorching hood of the car in the midday summer sun. He smirked, relishing the fear in her eyes, ignoring her pleas about the warm receipt still in her pocket. The absolute power of the man with the gun crushing a vulnerable mother in a crowded street. But his laughter died as a large figure emerged from a black SUV that had screeched to a halt, tires smoking, his eyes dark, like harbingers of death. On the man's back wasn't fear, but words that commanded deference from the entire underworld: Navy SEAL. The chief didn't know the woman he'd just humiliated was the wife of a Special Forces operative, a living weapon just returned from hell. In the instant, the police officer crumpled to the ground under an iron grip. A truth more horrifying than racial discrimination itself was laid bare. This arrest wasn't random. It was a staged setup, orchestrated by those who wanted to silence a witness holding top-secret military intelligence. A secret that could burn this entire town to the ground. Is the police badge a shield for justice, or merely a tool for those pulling strings in the shadows? And when the Code Unit 77 is activated, who will truly be the hunter? If the person pinned to the street in front of everyone was the one you loved most, what would you do? Leave your answer, and watch till the end, because the truth about to be revealed will leave you on the edge of your seat. Naomi Carter stepped out of the boutique, the receipt still warm in her pocket, as the midday sun poured down like a harsh beam, trying to expose every step she took. The asphalt street was so hot, it gave off a faint, burnt smell, and the distant sound of traffic mixed with the slow rhythm of a white neighborhood Naomi had never felt she belonged to. She took a shallow breath, trying to stay calm like she always did when passing through this area, trying to avoid any eyes that might cause trouble. A man standing in front of the nail salon looked her up and down, and without a single word, his stare alone made Naomi feel like she had just stepped into a place where her presence was not welcome. The scream came so suddenly that Naomi turned around on instinct. The boutique clerk came running out, hair a mess, face flushed red, her shrill voice echoing down the street. "She stole something. I told you." She stuffed things into her bag. She pointed straight at Naomi like she was aiming an accusation, her face showing not a trace of doubt, as if Naomi had just thrown a bomb into the store. An old man nearby shook his head and muttered, "Knew it." A woman pushing a stroller stopped to watch, then turned to her friend, speaking low but loud enough for Naomi to hear. "Stuff like this happens around here all the time." Naomi opened her bag and pulled out the receipt, her hand trembling from shock and confusion. "I already paid. This is the receipt," she said, trying to hold it out in front of the clerk. No one reached to take it. The boutique employee stepped back, raised her chin, and said, "I don't need to see that piece of paper. My store has cameras." A teenage boy filming with his phone had it yanked down hard by his mother. She snapped, "Put that down. Stay out of this kind of trouble." He stared at Naomi for a long second before pocketing his phone, his eyes filled with judgment. The crowd gathered only to look at Naomi as if she were a curiosity in the harsh sunlight. A woman nearby sniffed. "These people are always pulling the same stunt." A man in a company polo stood with arms crossed, chewing gum slowly. Bet she hid something in her purse. Naomi tried to speak slowly so her voice wouldn't catch. "I didn't take anything. I only bought a scarf." She raised the receipt higher, hoping someone would look, hoping for a shred of fairness, but no eyes turned to the paper. Every eye was locked on the color of her skin. In that moment, Naomi felt her small footsteps swallowed whole. She stood in the middle of the street, clutching the receipt like it was the only thing that could save her. But it was useless when the whole neighborhood had already decided to believe the clerk's scream. No one asked questions, no one checked, no one wanted details. They just looked at Naomi, looked at her skin, and decided the whole story for themselves. The feeling wrapped tight around Naomi's chest like a cold hand, choking the breath out of her. A middle-aged man walked up, one hand on his hip, eyeing Naomi with built-in suspicion. "If you didn't steal anything, then why did the store call?" Naomi turned to him, trying to stay calm. "The store didn't call. She falsely accused me. You can check the camera with me." He laughed. "Why bother with the camera? She said there's a video. That's enough." Those words hit Naomi, not with anger but with a raw, blatant contempt. She swallowed the lump in her throat, trying to keep her composure even as her fingers gripped the receipt tighter and tighter. She looked around, hoping someone, just one person, would ask what had happened, or simply look at the paper in her hand. But the crowd's silence felt like thick glass, keeping them from hearing anything Naomi said. They just wanted to watch a woman of color standing in the street, confused and powerless. An older woman stared at Naomi for a moment. Her gaze wasn't cruel, just distant. She said quietly, just loud enough for the person next to her to hear, "I don't think she's hurting anyone, but oh well, it's not my business." Naomi felt like the whole neighborhood had pushed her into an invisible corner. She tried to take a deep breath, tried to hold on to the calm that years of living in this white town had taught her. But the murmurs around her only made it harder. "Look at that. She's acting all calm, must be used to this," a young woman whispered. "Who knows how many times she's done it," her friend replied. Naomi turned toward them. "I didn't do that." The words came out like a defense from someone already sinking. Sweat started to slide down Naomi's back as more people gathered. A man in dark sunglasses stood with arms crossed, asking the boutique employee, "You sure?" The employee nodded firmly. "I'm sure. We've got cameras in the store." She tried to run, but I caught her. Naomi's eyes widened. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The helplessness made her knees feel weak, but she stood straight. "I didn't run. I was just going to my car." The crowd chuckled quietly, not loud but sharp enough to slice into her pride. She turned to the employee. "Can you come check the video with me?" The employee folded her arms. "I don't need to. I saw it happen." Naomi slowly shook her head. "You're lying. I paid." Is stuck. The crowd seemed to be waiting for that moment to erupt. A man muttered, "If she paid, why's she yelling?" Someone else laughed. "People only fight back when they've got something to hide." Naomi looked back down the street she'd just walked, and it suddenly felt longer than usual. A crowd stood there, ready to judge, ready to label her a thief with nothing more than an employee's shout. The receipt in her hand now felt like a worthless scrap of paper. No one looked at it. No one cared. In that moment, Naomi realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. She was standing in the middle of a sentence already passed, one the neighborhood had decided before she even stepped out of the store, and that feeling weighed heavier than the sun, beating down on her shoulders. The boutique employee turned back inside like she had already won, dragging Naomi along with her eyes full of the urge to corner someone. Another clerk stood behind the counter, and as soon as she saw her colleague walk in, she immediately pulled up the security footage, her voice buzzing with excitement, like she was about to perform a show for the entire neighborhood. She zoomed in on the clip and tapped the counter lightly. "Here, look. Clear as day." On the screen was an image of Naomi walking between the shelves, then bending down as if stuffing something into her purse. The crowd behind pushed forward to get a better view, and murmurs rose like a hive breaking loose. Naomi froze, her stomach tightening. "That camera doesn't cover this angle." "There's no camera positioned there in the store," she said. Her voice choked with confusion. The boutique clerk immediately cut her off with a sharp tone. "Be quiet. Look at that. That's clearly you." "It bet." Naomi felt her hands trembling slightly, but forced herself to stay still. The video on the screen made her feel like she was falling into a pit. That wasn't her. The way that person moved didn't match her habits, but the crowd didn't care about that. A white man nearby glanced over and scoffed. "I know this type. You can tell right away." He looked around, hoping someone would nod in agreement. A curly-haired woman behind him clicked her tongue. "If there's a camera, that's all we need. How long is she going to keep denying it?" Naomi opened her mouth to speak, but another woman's voice cut in sharply. "What's the point of arguing? It's on video, clear as day." The space around the checkout counter grew stuffy, like a storage room with no air. Naomi felt her head heating up, not just from the sun outside, but from all the eyes glued to her. She stared at the screen, then looked around, hoping to find a single face willing to think differently, but all she saw were heads shaking with built-in bias. A young guy near the counter raised his eyebrows. "See? No wonder she walked out so fast." His mother slapped his shoulder lightly, but still muttered, "Such a pain." Naomi swallowed hard, questions storming through her mind. What just happened? Who did this? Was that footage really from a camera in the store? Or something more sophisticated? But no one wanted to hear any of that. She turned to the clerk. "I didn't do this. You know very well I paid." The clerk shook her head with a smug, infuriating smile. "You can say whatever you want. The proof is right here." She spun the screen to show everyone, as if Naomi were just another shocking clip in some trashy reality show. A man standing nearby waved his hand. "I saw her looking around earlier. Doesn't surprise me." Naomi felt like she was spinning in a storm of humiliation, every word raining down without logic or evidence. The crowd formed an invisible circle, pressing in like a pack of predators surrounding prey. A woman in nurse scrubs standing at the back whispered bitterly, "There's always some excuse, always saying they're innocent." Next to her, a guy in a baseball cap with arms crossed added, "If she's innocent, why would she be scared to watch the video?" Naomi took a deep breath to keep her voice steady. "I'm not afraid to watch it. I'm saying that the camera doesn't cover that angle." The boutique clerk swiped her hand over the screen, like she could erase any lingering doubt. "I know exactly where my cameras are. Stop putting on a show." Someone near the door muttered, "Just call the cops already. What's the point of standing around?" The crowd seemed to agree. Some nodded. Others chimed in, "Yeah, call them. People like this don't belong on the street." Naomi heard that line and felt like someone had stamped a label across her forehead. A label she thought she had grown used to over the years, but every time she heard it, it still cut just as deep. The air seemed to tighten when a man behind the counter said, "Call the police. Get it over with." The boutique employee looked at Naomi and smirked. "You just stay right there. I'll make the call now." Naomi felt her heart pounding, her throat dry, but she forced herself to stay calm. She knew if she raised her voice, it would only convince them she had something to hide. She looked around again, hoping someone would speak up for her, but no one did. Some had started filming. The rest stared at her like they were watching a play they already knew the ending to. Naomi turned toward the door, squinting as the bright midday sun pierced through the glass. Just minutes ago, she had been a woman buying a scarf for an anniversary. Now, she had been turned into a criminal in front of complete strangers. The crowd didn't see her pain or fear. They only saw what they believed was true. A flicker of hope passed through Naomi's mind. Maybe when the police arrived, they'd look at the receipt. They'd listen. They'd understand. But the heavy pressure in her chest stayed. It felt like being trapped in darkness at noon, with no way out, no one to lean on, no one who believed a word she said. The patrol car sped into the parking lot in front of the boutique so fast that the screech of tires on pavement startled several people. Naomi turned around, her heart tightening as she saw the county-branded vehicle swing sharply toward the curb, like it was zeroing in on a target. Sheriff Walter Briggs stepped out, one hand on his hip, a crooked smile spreading across his face, An odd kind of satisfaction, like he'd been waiting all day for a chance to put on a show of force in front of a gathering crowd. He looked Naomi up and down, eyes scanning her like inspecting a defective item, then gave a slight nod to the boutique employee standing behind her. "All right, I'll take it from here." Briggs didn't ask Naomi a single question. He didn't need facts or evidence. He just barked, his voice slamming into her like a slap. "Put the bag down, right now." Each word hit like a drill sergeant's order, silencing the entire street. Naomi flinched slightly and tried to keep her voice steady. "I have the receipt, But before she could finish, Briggs stepped forward and yanked the bag from her hands. He opened it with zero care, like he was searching a criminal's belongings, then pulled out the receipt, glanced at it for barely a second, and tossed it to the ground. "Anyone can print this crap," he said, his voice full of contempt that made Naomi instinctively want to step back, though her legs felt frozen. Naomi bent down to pick up the receipt, her hand trembling slightly. His voice dropped low but cut like a blade. "You think you can fool me?" Naomi steadied herself. "I paid. You can check with the staff. I didn't do anything wrong." Briggs let out a short, sharp laugh, cold enough to slash at her dignity. "People like you always steal," he said flatly, as if stating an undeniable fact that needed no emphasis. The crowd behind Briggs started murmuring. A man with arms crossed nodded to his friend. "Told you. You can tell just by the look." A young woman snapped a few photos, clearly eager to post them online before the moment passed. Naomi drew a deep breath to stop herself from crying in front of them. "I didn't steal anything," she said. Briggs waved her off. "Everyone says that." Naomi turned to the boutique employee, hoping she would change her story. But the woman just folded her arms, looking satisfied. "I saw it clearly, Officer Briggs." "The video's still playing at the counter?" Briggs nodded and stepped closer to Naomi, the distance making her feel the stale mix of cigarette smoke and leftover coffee on his breath. "You think you're smarter than this whole town?" he asked. Naomi stepped back half a pace, her voice softer but steady. "I didn't do anything wrong." An older woman standing on the sidewalk had been watching for a long time. She clasped her hands together, a flicker of concern in her eyes. She whispered to the person next to her, "This doesn't feel right." But she didn't step forward, didn't raise her voice, didn't dare push through the circle of onlookers now watching Naomi like a play no one wanted to miss. The person beside her shrugged. "Let the cops handle it. Getting involved's just asking for trouble." Briggs bent down and picked up the receipt with 2 fingers, as if touching something filthy. He held it up close to Naomi's face. "You think this piece of paper is going to save you?" Then he threw it back on the ground, this time with even more contempt. Naomi watched as the paper was blown sideways by the wind, and it felt like her truth was being carried away with it. "I'll say it one more time," Briggs said, his voice lower and more threatening than before. "Put your hands behind your back and stay still." Naomi opened her mouth to protest. "I wasn't running. I didn't take anything. Please don't." Briggs barked so loudly that a few children nearby flinched and started crying. "I said drop the bag and stay still." Naomi stood surrounded by eyes waiting for a show. She felt like she was losing something vital. Not her rights, but the last bit of dignity she had left. She thought of all the stories on the news, all the black people treated like criminals before anyone bothered to ask a question. She never imagined she would be the one standing in the street like this, stared at with suspicion from every angle. Even though she knew she had done nothing wrong, Briggs stepped in close enough to make Naomi feel overwhelmed. He moved one hand behind him like he was ready to cuff her right there. The crowd murmured again. One man said quietly, "Briggs is always right." Another replied, "Just look at her. You can tell something's off." Naomi tried to steady her voice. "You've got it wrong." "I didn't," Briggs glared. "Say one more word." He looked at Naomi like she was a criminal trying to escape justice, with the cold, annoyed stare of someone used to abusing power. Naomi stood still for a few seconds, feeling her whole body pulled tight. She knew that no matter what she said now, no one would believe her. Briggs leaned in to make sure she heard every word. In this town, if I say you're guilty, then you're guilty. Those words made Naomi's spine go cold, even as the sun blazed overhead. She heard someone behind her mutter, "Just arrest her already. Why keep talking?" Naomi looked around one last time, hoping anyone would speak up, say just one sentence to say she deserved a chance to explain. But the crowd just watched her like it was free entertainment. No one stepped forward, no one questioned anything, no one asked, and the weight of that silence crushed Naomi like a massive stone on her shoulders. In the harsh sunlight, she felt stripped of all dignity, branded in the exact way she had feared for so many years, and this time, there was no way out. Briggs grabbed Naomi's shoulder and shoved her so hard that her back slammed into the boutique's glass door, the impact echoing sharp and dry in the still midday air. Her whole body jolted, her face pressed against the cold glass, cheek nearly stuck to the thin layer of dust left behind. Naomi tried to turn her head to the side to breathe. But Briggs leaned in closer, his breath thick with cigarettes and old coffee washing over her neck, making her shudder. The stench spun her around inside, choking off every word she had tried to keep in her throat. Briggs loomed behind her, his broad hand pressing down on her neck, as if he meant to keep pushing until she broke. She heard him laugh softly. The kind of laugh that came from someone used to enforcing his power without anyone daring to push back. "Skin like yours," Briggs said, his voice more of a growl than speech. Every word fell slowly but heavily, enough to make Naomi want to shut her eyes tight. Her body trembled not from fear, but from the rising wave of shame. Every sentence he spoke was meant to push her lower. She wanted to turn her head, wanted to look him in the eyes, but the pressure was so strong she had to count each breath just to keep standing. The crowd behind Briggs started murmuring again. A middle-aged man said loudly enough for the people around him to hear, "If she's been arguing this long, no way she's innocent." A woman clutching shopping bags leaned near the door to get a better look, her expression a mix of curiosity and disdain. "Just look at the way she's standing. Tells you everything," the woman added. Naomi heard it all. No one bothered to lower their voices. She swallowed the tightness in her chest, but the more she tried to stay calm, the more Briggs pushed her against the glass, like he wanted her to know her silence wasn't mercy. Just permission he gave. Small footsteps approached from the side. A boy, maybe 10 years old, tugged on his father's hand. He looked at Naomi, then at Briggs, his face so honest it made something sting inside her. "Why does he hate that lady, Dad?" he asked, eyes wide, not understanding what he was seeing. The father looked around nervously, avoiding his son's gaze, then squeezed the boy's hand. "Come on, don't ask questions." He pulled the boy back, as if afraid his child might catch whatever trouble this was. Naomi heard it clearly. It wasn't the boy's question that stung, but the father's refusal to name the truth his son had already seen. Sometimes, adults' silence is heavier than any insult. Briggs pressed down harder, Naomi feeling her neck forced tighter, her breathing ragged. "Don't lift your head," Briggs growled in her ear, slow and heavy. "Someone like you doesn't need to pretend to be decent." Naomi bit her lip, holding back any sound, fighting not to cry in front of the people watching like it was a sidewalk show. Sweat trickled down her neck. But she kept her back straight, refusing to collapse the way Briggs seemed to want. Being treated like something beneath him, something he could press down at will, lit in her the last bit of strength to hold on to her dignity. That resistance seemed to irritate Briggs even more. He shoved harder, this time enough to force a sharp breath of pain from her. "Still trying to act tough?" he said, his voice lower now, laced with mockery. Naomi turned her face just enough to keep it from the glass, even though she knew it would make him angrier. A woman nearby muttered, "Whatever. They always act like they're the victim." An older man beside her added, "Let Briggs handle it. He knows what he's doing." Those words made Naomi feel like she was being smothered. It was as if the entire town had chosen to side with Briggs, no matter what she said. Briggs placed his other arm on Naomi's shoulder, forcing her slightly sideways, locking her completely in place. He leaned even closer, his breath hot, stretching each word out. "You think standing up straight earns my respect? I've seen 100 just like you." Naomi closed her eyes for a second, the ache in her forehead from being pressed against the glass, making her want to lash out. But she knew if she said anything more, Briggs would twist it into another excuse to accuse her again. She stayed silent, not out of surrender, but because she refused to waste her last breath answering someone who didn't even see her as human. But that silence only made Briggs angrier. "Lift your head," he snapped, yanking her hair to force her face toward the street. "Let everyone see the face of someone who likes to take what's not theirs." No one stepped in. No one spoke up. No one even frowned. They just watched. A few people raised their phones to record. Naomi felt her eyes sting, but she didn't let the tears fall. She wanted to hold on to the one thing Briggs hadn't taken yet, her pride. But standing there, surrounded by whispers, by Briggs's voice dripping with humiliation, and by the judging eyes of everyone around her, Naomi felt as if she was being stripped bare in front of the whole town. And maybe that hurt more than anything else Briggs could do to her. Briggs shifted his grip so fast that Naomi hadn't even finished feeling the pain in her shoulder before her wrist was twisted at such a sharp angle that the joint cracked with a dry, sharp pop. The pain shot straight up her arm, forcing a gasp from her lips as her body buckled half a step in reflex. Briggs leaned in, his mouth curling into the kind of smile anyone could recognize. The smile of a man who just found an excuse to use more force than necessary. Naomi tried to steady herself, but Briggs yanked her arm higher, twisting again, sending a searing jolt down her spine. "Stand still," Briggs growled right beside her ear, as if her trembling body gave him reason to doubt her. Footsteps approached from behind and stopped. Deputy Luke Harris stepped in beside them, one hand resting lightly on his holster, his thumb tapping in a slow rhythm, clearly excited. He was young, and the bloodlust was obvious in the way he tilted his head to look at Naomi like she was a beaten opponent waiting for the final blow. "Best if you cooperate," Luke said, his voice both shaky and eager, his breath short like he was watching a fight and rooting for the knockout. Naomi could feel it. Both Briggs and Luke wanted to see her break, wanted her to become a living example of how power worked on a black woman in broad daylight. Naomi took a sharp breath, trying not to let it turn into a sob. She tried to turn her face, but Briggs forced it down immediately, his arm locking over her shoulder and yanking her forward until her balance gave way, and she collapsed to the blistering pavement. Her knees hit the asphalt, the burn like hot metal pressed to her skin, and she cried out from the pain. But Briggs kept her arm pinned behind her back, forcing her spine into a deep arch that offered no escape. Naomi planted her free hand on the ground to support herself, but Briggs stepped on that wrist, forcing her body to collapse forward entirely. A sharp inhale came from the crowd. A few people instinctively stepped back, though none moved to intervene. Luke stood just beside her, leaning slightly to watch, his face set like he was enjoying the scene. "You're only making things worse for yourself," he said, his voice louder now, rising with the adrenaline. Naomi clenched her teeth, refusing to let a single word escape. She knew if she said even one more thing, they'd twist it into a reason to justify everything they were doing. Briggs drove his knee into her back, pressing down to lock her in place, forcing another wave of sharp pain through her body. She heard his voice rising, projecting for the crowd, turning the moment into a show he wanted everyone to remember. "Resisting a law officer," Briggs shouted, his voice echoing loud enough to pierce every window on the block. "She's resisting? See that?" Naomi jerked her head up in reflex. "I'm not resisting. I didn't." But before she could finish, Briggs shoved her head down, pressing her cheek to the rough pavement. She could feel the heat and grit against her skin, the scorched smell and dust right under her nose. The burning surface seared into her face, and she squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the heat rising off the ground, stinging her skin. The crowd murmured again. Some people raised their phones to record, while others shook their heads like they were watching something they had predicted from the very beginning. A man standing a little farther back crossed his arms and commented, "Told you, she's shady." A woman pressed her lips together. "You can tell, just by how she's reacting." None of them noticed Naomi being pinned so hard she couldn't move. No one saw her wrists turning red and purple. No one heard her gasping for breath under the pressure. To them, everything had been clear from the first scream. Briggs grabbed Naomi's wrist again and yanked it back. Her groan was muffled because her face was still pressed to the ground. He pulled out the handcuffs, worked quickly, and the cold metal clamped onto Naomi's skin with a sharp click. She flinched from the pain, but Briggs took that as more resistance and shouted again, "See that? Still fighting!" The cuffs bit into her skin, and her hand began to go numb, fingers curling involuntarily. Naomi tried to turn her head to breathe, but Briggs placed one hand on the back of her neck, forcing her to face the pavement. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice thick with threat. Luke looked at Briggs, then over at Naomi, the corner of his mouth twisting into a strange grin Naomi had only seen in bad movies about corrupt cops. "Do you realize you're holding up the whole neighborhood right now?" Luke said, as if Naomi had chosen to create a scene. Naomi bit her lips so hard she could taste faint blood at the tip of her tongue, but kept the sound of crying trapped in her throat. She felt humiliation spreading across her chest, a tangled mess of pain and despair, anger, and helplessness. Briggs glanced around like he was searching for an audience, then shouted again, "Call a car to take her to the station." Naomi heard the footsteps of the boutique employee approaching. Her voice cut in, "Mr. Briggs, make sure you note that she resisted." Naomi shut her eyes, feeling the whole neighborhood pressing down on her back through Briggs's knee. In that moment, Naomi realized she had fallen straight into the thing she had feared for years. It wasn't the shouting, or the hand on her head, or even the cuffs around her wrists. She was being seen as a criminal before she ever got to speak, being stepped on without anyone needing a reason. And when Briggs yanked her up by her cuffed wrists, her body hurt so badly her legs shook. She knew this was only the beginning of a much bigger nightmare to come. The watch on Damian Carter's wrist buzzed hard, as someone had just jolted a live wire straight into his skin. The screen flashed red. Naomi. No movement for 180 seconds. Damian was standing at the garage door, still holding the screwdriver mid-air. He read it again, and again. Naomi was not the kind of person to stand still in the middle of the street for 3 full minutes, unless something was very wrong. The alert hit cold in his chest, then immediately flared into heat. He opened the GPS. The red dot was frozen right in front of the boutique. Naomi said she'd stop by. Under the sharp sun, Damian felt his blood start to move in a way that was all too familiar. Dangerously so. A reflex he thought he'd locked away after years of service. The veins in his neck stood out. His breath grew deep. He called Naomi. 2 rings, then silence. He called again, voice tighter now. "Naomi, pick up. Talk to me." Nothing but the long, empty tone. Damian took a few quick steps toward the gate, but soldier instinct stopped him. He turned and ran straight for the black SUV, parked beside the garage. He threw open the door, tossed the toolbox onto the passenger seat, slammed the door shut, and fired up the engine. His foot hit the gas hard, spinning the tires into a sharp black streak across the concrete. The SUV shot out of the driveway, the engine's roar bouncing off the walls. He kept one hand on the wheel, the other holding the watch close to his face, tracking the red dot pulsing faster. Every time the GPS vibrated, his jaw clenched tighter. The route from his house to the shopping district was only a few blocks, but today it stretched out like a marathon. He took the first turn so sharply that the tires grazed the curb. Damien didn't care. All he could see was the red text, "Naomi, still," of the Stevan. Wind slammed through the open window, carrying the hot smell of sun-baked asphalt. But Damien didn't slow. He called again. "Naomi, it's me. Where are you?" No answer. Just the engine growling louder every time he sank his foot deeper into the pedal. When he was 1 block from the boutique, Damien spotted the flicker of police lights in the rearview mirror. At the same time, he saw a crowd gathered, packed tight in front of the shop. The sight chilled his spine. Crowds like that, at this hour, never meant anything good. Damien eased off the gas just slightly, but didn't stop. He swerved past 2 parked cars, eyes locked on the group ahead. From over 100 meters away, he could make out a figure being forced down, both arms twisted behind them. A cop stood close behind, leaning into the person's back. Damien squinted. His heart thumped once, hard, when he realized it was Naomi. Her hair had fallen over half her face. Her arms were yanked so far back that her shoulders were uneven. Another officer was rummaging through her bag, tossing items onto the ground like trash. Damien's blood surged. He gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles whitening. The anger rising in him wasn't the kind that burst out. It was the kind he knew too well. The kind that came when a teammate got pinned down in silence, when cold crept down your spine and turned into fire in your chest. He inhaled, slow and heavy, then slammed the accelerator. The SUV surged forward, the engine roaring so loud a few people in the crowd turned toward the street. Damien felt the pulse in his temples hammering. He didn't know exactly what had happened, but he knew Naomi would never stand still in the middle of a street for 3 minutes without a serious reason. And he knew what he was seeing now was wrong. As he got closer, the scene sharpened. Naomi was being held like a criminal. Her head hung low. Her wrists were cuffed, skin reddened from the strain. Her belongings lay scattered across the asphalt, and the face of the man digging through her bag wore a look of twisted satisfaction. The black SUV screeched to a stop at the edge of the crowd, its tires skidding halfway around and leaving a dark streak on the pavement. The engine had just cut off, but the heat in the air still trembled from it, startling those nearby into turning around. A few people stepped back instinctively, as if afraid the vehicle might barrel straight into them. The entire block fell silent for a few seconds as the car door opened. There was something about the way that SUV pulled up that set off an alarm in everyone's gut. Damien stepped out. Not rushed, not frantic, but every step he took landed with its own weight. His shoulders were broad, his frame tall and solid, and the look he swept across the crowd was sharp like a blade fresh from the fire. The people nearest to Naomi shifted aside, as if an invisible force had pushed them away. No one said anything, but someone drew a breath so quietly it still sounded loud. Damien didn't look at them for more than a second. His eyes landed exactly where they needed to. On Naomi. She was still bent forward, her head pulled down, wrists cuffed and yanked behind her. Briggs stood close, one hand gripping her shoulder, the other holding her wallet like evidence. The sunlight washed Naomi's face pale, sweat tracing down her temple. When her eyes lifted and met Damien's, she didn't say a word, but the look was clear. She had been broken. Damien took a few more steps forward. Across his back, the words Navy SEAL stood out in the sunlight. The letters weren't large, weren't flashy, but bold enough for anyone behind him to read. A young man holding his phone lowered it, muttering almost to himself, "Shit, he's actually military." The person next to him froze, lips parting without sound. An older woman raised a hand to her mouth, eyes wide. "Navy? SEAL?" she whispered. The murmur spread, running down the sidewalk like a wave of heat. Briggs saw the letters. He paused just half a second. Not long enough for the crowd to think he was scared, but just enough for Damien to catch the flicker. Luke, meanwhile, stood frozen, one hand on his holster, as it had turned to stone. He swallowed hard, his gaze flicking from Damien's back to Briggs, waiting for direction. Damien stopped about 2 meters from Briggs. His breathing was steady, but his expression carried the weight of an oncoming storm. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. He spoke low, every word landing like a hammer. "Let my wife go." Those 3 words silenced the crowd so completely that the wind brushing against the awnings was suddenly audible. Naomi looked up, eyes red but now lit with something again. Briggs blinked, trying to mask the crack in his resolve. "She stole something," he said louder than usual, clinging to the shield of authority. "Step back and let me do my job." Damien didn't move. "You're humiliating her in front of the entire town," he said, his voice calm, low, but missing nothing. "Take your hands off her." Luke glanced at the scene, then stepped forward halfway, like he was still in control. But as he came closer to Damien, his breath shifted. "Sheriff, look at him," Luke said under his breath. "He's not just anybody." Briggs clenched his teeth, trying to hold steady. "I'm not afraid of some ex-melee." Damien stepped in half a pace. Briggs went silent instantly. In that moment, the whole crowd felt the difference between the 2 men. It wasn't about size, it wasn't about rank. It was in the way Damien stood, the angle of his jaw, the tilt of his shoulders, every inch of him trained to take down a threat in seconds. A man in the crowd whispered. Briggs just stepped back. Someone replied, "He knows who he's dealing with." The words spread, one person to the next. All eyes locked onto the words Navy SEAL, like it was a sign that everything had just shifted. Damien spoke again, colder this time. "Take your hands off her." Naomi looked at him, lips trembling, but she didn't speak. Briggs glanced at her, then at the crowd, now fully focused on him, and finally back at Damien. Something in his eyes cracked the instinct of a cop, knowing where the line is. But pride and years of unchecked power kept him standing. "I haven't finished questioning her," Briggs said, voice tight. Damien cut in. Not loud, but sharp enough to slice clean. "You're done. You humiliated her in front of this whole town. You twisted her arm until it bruised. You went through her things in the street. What you're doing is wrong." "It's Tass." A woman nearby leaned over to get a clearer look at Naomi's wrist. It was so red and purple it hurt just to see. She covered her mouth. "Oh my God." Briggs tried to hold on to authority. "Step back," he said, but the end of the sentence fell away. Damien didn't answer. He only tilted his head slightly, eyes fixed and unmoving. His silence hit harder than a shout. A heavy pause swallowed the sounds of the street. Then Damien stepped forward again, close enough that Briggs instinctively took a step back. At that point, no one in the crowd had any questions left. Some lowered their phones, some whispered that this wasn't going to end the way Briggs wanted. A child clung to his father and asked quietly, "Daddy? What's happening?" The father looked at Damien, then Naomi, and answered in a low voice, "You're seeing a man protect his wife." Damien stood there, eyes locked on Briggs, and everyone understood. The balance had shifted. From the moment he stepped out of that SUV, Briggs tried to hold his posture as the man in control, but his voice lost its rhythm the moment Damien stepped out of the SUV. He was about to turn and bark like he always did when trying to intimidate someone in town, But as he turned his head, the midday sun caught the back of Damien's shirt. Briggs's eyes paused for 1 second, then widened. The words Navy SEAL were printed clearly, like they'd been seared in with red-hot iron. That single second froze Briggs's entire body. The look on his face shifted from aggression to pale shock, then to something resembling fear, something he tried to hide, but failed. His throat twitched. He knew what those words meant. They weren't a title, they were a warning. Luke, standing behind him, had thought Briggs might snap back with a retort. But when he saw the sheriff's expression, he looked toward Damien's back too. The second he saw a Navy SEAL, the color drained from his face to something close to sand. His hand was still on his gun, but his thumb had stopped tapping it, curled up like it no longer knew where to rest. Luke stepped back 2 paces, naturally, like his legs made the decision for him. He moved so fast that he bumped into someone behind him. That person flinched and stepped back too, not knowing why. Luke swallowed, lips trembling, eyes locked on Damien. "Sheriff?" he said quietly, but Briggs didn't answer. Damien's face didn't change. He didn't smile, didn't raise his voice, didn't repeat himself after the 2 words he'd already said twice. "Let my wife go." He simply walked forward. The first step was slow but heavy, like a boulder rolling downhill. Briggs flinched and stepped back on reflex, not even realizing he was retreating. Damien took another step, eyes fixed only on Naomi. A heavy silence blanketed the street, so thick you could hear the soft rustle of his sleeves as he moved. Briggs took another step back, this time stumbling over his own heel, nearly losing his balance. Damien didn't need to change his stance. All the force was in the way he stood, the way his shoulders angled, the way his eyes never blinked. It was the kind of authority no small-town cop could fake. Damien stepped forward again, and Briggs staggered back, clumsy now, like a man facing a truth he had no strength to confront. The crowd watched as if witnessing a power shift right before their eyes. One man whispered, "God, Briggs is backing off." The person next to him replied, "Not his day today." Naomi watched Damien getting closer, each of his steps lifting the weight off her chest, even though her wrists still throbbed like they were chained with steel. Her eyes locked on him, clinging to his calm, like a lifeline in a crashing wave. Briggs looked at Naomi, then back at Damien, the 2 images hitting him at once. A small woman, her arms twisted and bruised by his grip. A man from a unit he'd only heard about in the news, the kind of man even federal agents knew better than to cross. Briggs opened his mouth, trying to say something to save face. I'm handling the situation." Damien stepped forward again, and Briggs swallowed the rest of his sentence. Damien didn't need to speak. He just looked at Briggs. His eyes weren't full of explosive rage. They were full of a deeper kind of anger, the anger of someone who had seen injustice too many times to stay still. It made Briggs step back again, his shoulders trembling slightly. Luke breathed hard, glancing at Briggs for direction, but no longer sure which side he was on. Damien reached Naomi, now only half a step from Briggs. Naomi stood between them, but Damien didn't shove or touch Briggs. He simply stood there, leaving Briggs to decide what to do in the face of power far beyond his own. Damien spoke again, this time so low it seemed to fall to the ground. "Take your hands off her." Briggs held Damien's gaze for more than a second, then looked down at the hand he still had on Naomi's shoulder. He pulled it back on instinct. He pulled it so fast, his arm trembled slightly. The crowd started murmuring. Some people covered their mouths, others turned to each other in disbelief. A woman whispered, "He's really scared now." A man replied, "Who wouldn't be?" The moment Briggs let go of Naomi, Damien stepped forward half a step more. Briggs flinched and stepped back. This time, the edge of his shoe caught on the curb. He tried to steady himself, but it was too late. His knee hit the ground. There was a sharp, dry thud, loud enough to sound like a seal being stamped on his own pride. Everyone heard it. A young man nearby raised both hands to his head. Holy! He actually went down on one knee. And that 20 eds. Briggs gasped, his head dropping from the jolt, one hand pressed to the pavement. He didn't fall completely, but it was enough. Enough for the whole town to witness a scene they never thought they'd see. After decades of abusing power, after years of people shrinking from his bark, now his knee had hit the ground in front of a man who hadn't raised his voice once. Naomi looked up. Her eyes were red again, but this time not from shame, from witnessing the truth flip. The truth is that Briggs wasn't strong. He was only strong in front of people who had no one to protect them. Damien stood beside her, tall, shoulders squared. He hadn't laid a hand on Briggs. He didn't look smug. He stared down for a few seconds, his eyes not mocking, not angry, just cold. The kind of cold that doesn't need to prove anything. Damien lowered his head slightly. His voice wasn't loud, but it was iron. Get up. I haven't. Briggs met his eyes briefly, then looked down at the ground. He braced his hand and slowly stood, slow enough that the whole crowd held their breath. When he stood upright again, his eyes no longer looked like the sheriff's. They looked like a man who had just realized he was on the wrong side of a fight he was never going to win. The crowd stayed silent. No one moved. Everyone understood. The fake power Briggs had leaned on for so many years had collapsed in broad daylight, in an instant, under a single word printed on the back of Damien's shirt. Navy SEAL. Briggs had just gotten to his feet, his face still pale from the involuntary fall to his knees, when Damien took another step forward. The distance between them shrank to the point where Briggs had to tilt his head back to look Damien in the eyes. No one in the crowd dared breathe. Naomi stood beside them, her wrists still cuffed, breath broken from pain, but her eyes never left Damien, as if he were the only thing keeping her from collapsing onto the pavement. Damien tilted his head slightly, looking down at the cuffs, digging into Naomi's wrists. The metal had bitten deep into her skin, leaving a trail of purple-red bruising along the bone. He stared at the marks for just 1 second, but it was enough to shift his entire presence. His back tensed, his shoulders lifted closer to his ears in that unmistakable military way. Even the way he breathed changed, deep, slow, compressed. And Briggs saw all of it. He instinctively stepped back half a pace, but Damien's hand shot out and grabbed Briggs's wrist, twisting it at an angle no one caught clearly. Only the sound gave it away, the sharp hiss of Briggs sucking air through clenched teeth. Ah, let go. Briggs bent under the small motion, his face tightening, eyes squinting like light had stabbed through them. It wasn't a bone-breaking move. It was precise, surgical, every joint pushed just enough to hit the most sensitive spot, painful enough to drop a man in power to his knees, but not enough for any officer to accuse Damien of excessive force. Damien didn't add pressure. He just held it there, his voice low and heavy like thunder being held back. "Touch her again," he said, each word dropping like forged steel, "and you lose this hand." No one heard it as a threat, because it wasn't. It was a fact. And Damien's voice carried it like a truth he had lived so many times that there was no need to raise it. Briggs opened his mouth, trying to resist, but the rapid breath in his chest reduced it to a low, ragged grunt. Not quite pain, not quite protest. It was the sound of a man who had just been placed in a position he'd never imagined he'd be forced to stand in. The crowd around them stirred louder now. A young man muttered, loud enough for everyone to catch, "Holy hell!" He twisted Briggs's arm like opening a bottle cap. The person next to him backed away, hand over mouth. "God, he really is SEAL. I said it. Look at the way he moves." A woman behind Naomi shook her head slowly, stunned and awed. "Never thought I'd see Briggs back down like that." Not in my life. Luke watched the scene unfold, his face gone pale. His hand was still resting on his holster, but he couldn't bring himself to draw. His thumb curled, frozen stiff. He stared at Briggs, his mentor, being folded over, and heard that sharp hiss of breath like a man doused in ice water. Luke stepped forward half a pace, tried to speak. "Hey, you can't!" But Damien turned his face toward Luke for exactly 1 second. Just one. And Luke froze, like someone had hit pause on his body. He backed away immediately. Damien gave Briggs's wrist the slightest twist. Briggs dropped lower, one knee hitting the ground, then the other tightening to keep balance. His face flushed red from pain, but he didn't fight back. He stared at the ground, shoulders trembling in tiny, helpless shakes. For the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to be controlled by someone else and have no way to stop it. Naomi stood right beside him, breathing hard from both pain and shock. The tears that spilled weren't from weakness. They came from the feeling of standing in the middle of a nightmare and seeing a hand reach in to stop it just when she feared she couldn't take another second. She looked at Damien with eyes full of gratitude and relief, as if the weight that had been crushing her chest had finally slid off. Damien saw the wetness at the corners of Naomi's eyes, saw her chest rising and falling in sharp, trembling breaths. He didn't let go of Briggs just yet. He held his grip steady, tilting his head slightly to speak loud enough for the crowd to hear, but his voice stayed calm, steady, restrained. "Everyone here just watched him twist her arm until it bruised," he said, eyes still locked on Briggs. Everyone saw it. A middle-aged woman nodded quickly. "Yes, I saw the whole thing from the start." A man behind her added, "He was pressing down on her way too hard." Briggs was breathing heavily, trying to salvage a shred of dignity. "I was carrying out my duty." But Damien shifted his grip just slightly. Briggs let out a strained grunt, like something caught in his throat. Damien leaned in closer to his ear. "You weren't doing your duty," he said, his voice low like wind across a blade. "You were abusing your power. You hurt my wife, and now you're going to stop." Only then did Damien ease his grip. Briggs instinctively yanked his hand back, fingers trembling too much to keep up the image of authority. He stood slowly, unsteady on his feet, unable to meet Damien's eyes. Behind him, Luke hovered uncertainly, like a man stuck between two sides, and his side was clearly losing. Damien turned to Naomi. His tone shifted completely, gentle now, a stark contrast to the steel he'd just delivered to Briggs. "Can you stand?" he asked softly. Naomi nodded, but just enough to stay upright. Damien reached out, not touching her, because her wrists were still cuffed, but close enough for her to lean on. Naomi looked up at him, tears streaking her cheeks, but her eyes were brighter than before. "I'm okay," she whispered, though her voice still shook. The crowd watched them, silent for a few long seconds. It was a moment no one thought they'd ever witness in this town, a town where Briggs was used to cutting people down with just a look. But today, it was Briggs who got brought down. Not with shouts, not with violence, but with one controlled twist, from a man who never raised his voice. Damien stood there, shielding Naomi with the full strength of his presence, like a wall between her and the world that had tried to crush her just moments earlier. And the whole street understood one thing. False power had just collapsed in front of their eyes. And that man, with one look and the word Navy SEAL across his back, had flipped the entire situation with a single turn of the hand. Briggs stood unsteadily, his hand still trembling from the light twist Damien had delivered. The air on the street had thickened, as if someone had forced everyone to hold their breath. The crowd stared at the town's sheriff, the man they once feared, once avoided, now stumbling like someone who had just walked away from a crash. Damien remained standing in front of Naomi, shielding her, his eyes still locked onto Briggs with unwavering focus. Briggs gasped for air, trying to find his voice, but the harder he tried, the more his breath fell short. I didn't mean to. He stopped, as if something was clenching his throat from the inside. Damien tilted his head slightly, his gaze sharper. Speak. A woman nearby covered her mouth. The entire street seemed to breathe as one. Briggs wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. His voice came out shattered, as it had broken into small pieces. I was just following orders. Damien's brow furrowed instantly. Naomi's eyes widened, her breath catching in surprise. Every excuse Briggs had prepared vanished. The only sentence that came out was the one he least meant to reveal. But it was already too late. Damien stepped forward. Orders from who? Briggs took half a step back, even though Damien hadn't touched him. I can't. Briggs swallowed, eyes shifting to Luke, as if hoping for backup. But Luke stepped even farther away. Damien repeated the question slowly, his voice dropping like a verdict. Orders from what? Naomi, still behind Damien, leaned slightly to see Briggs's face. As Briggs trembled, a broken sentence escaped his lips, so quiet it was almost meant for himself. They told me, hold her. 10 minutes. Naomi flinched, her eyes widening. Hold me. 10 minutes? She repeated, her voice weak but clear. Briggs closed his eyes for a moment, then lowered his head further. I got the message from outside. They told me to hold you for 10 minutes. Just 10 minutes. Naomi heard it like stones dropping into her chest. 10 minutes wasn't the phrase of someone falsely accusing. 10 minutes sounded like a command meant to set something bigger in motion. Who told you to do that? Damien asked again, his voice low but tightened around each word. Briggs went silent for a few seconds, then muttered, I don't know the real name. He just sent the order, said it would all be handled afterward. The vagueness only made Damien more alert. Damien turned to Naomi. Their eyes met for a second, but it was enough for both to understand what was becoming clearer and clearer. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't just another isolated act of racism. Naomi wasn't held because Briggs had a temper. She was held according to plan. A plan with a set time. 10 minutes. Damien turned back to Briggs, his gaze so cold that Briggs stepped back without being touched. Who gave the order? Briggs bit his lip, his shoulders sinking. He said, I didn't need to know. The system sent it. I just hit accept. Damien touched the back of Naomi's neck, as if to steady her, then stepped closer to Briggs. What system? Briggs opened his eyes and looked toward the government building at the corner. His hand trembled as he pointed. The city's camera system. The data network. It's all run by a private company now. I just get orders from them. Naomi followed Briggs's gesture. A chill slid down her spine. She remembered the moment she was accused inside the store, how the evidence video appeared just as she tried to respond. She remembered that the angle wasn't available in the boutique. She remembered Briggs's words earlier. They sent it to me. In Naomi's mind, the scattered pieces began to align. Private security company. Data. Hold her for 10 minutes. And a fake video timed perfectly. Damien saw the color shift in Naomi's face, and he knew she was putting the truth together too. Naomi? He asked softly. What are you thinking? Naomi swallowed hard, her voice low but tense. The video in the store. It wasn't from their camera. I know that angle, and the boutique doesn't have it. Someone created it. Someone wanted me held for 10 minutes. Briggs lowered his head even further, almost as if trying to avoid both of their eyes. Damien closed the distance until Briggs instinctively shifted into a defensive posture. Who's behind that system? Damien asked. Briggs trembled slightly. The company. It's called Rourke Security Systems. The town hired them, he said. He handles the tech side. End quote. Damien's whole body froze for exactly half a second. That was long enough for Naomi to realize something deeply dangerous had just struck his mind. His expression changed completely, rage replaced by a cold, stony stillness. He spoke slowly, almost in a whisper. Rourke who? Briggs couldn't look him in the eye. Damon Rourke. He runs the whole town's camera system, sends the auto alerts, sends the data. I just received it. His words came out, broken, weak. Naomi heard that name, and her heart skipped a beat. She turned to Damien. Damien. Who is Damon Rourke? Damien didn't answer right away. He stared at the ground for a few seconds, jaw clenched tight. When he finally looked up, his eyes had darkened as he had just opened a door he had hoped to keep locked forever. Damon Rourke, he said, voice heavy and low, is a former SEAL. Naomi froze. The crowd behind them murmured, but Damien didn't notice anyone else. He continued, voice low enough only Naomi could hear clearly. He was one of my old teammates, the one who betrayed us on our final mission. Damien looked toward the building Briggs had pointed at. He didn't just betray us. He disappeared with kill data from Syria. And now, he's running the entire security system of this town. Naomi gripped her swollen, bruised wrist. The air seemed to stop moving. Then Damien said the last line, not to Briggs, not to the crowd. He said it to Naomi. But the whole town heard him. You weren't falsely accused. You were targeted. And that was the moment everything shifted from a case of racial profiling to something far bigger, tied to the SEALs, to wartime intelligence, and to the most dangerous man ever to walk away from Damien's team, Damon Rourke. Just a few hours after Damien pulled Naomi out of that humiliating circle of onlookers, a 13-second video began circulating on social media. The footage was taken by the teenager who had been yanked back by his mother, but had still managed to start recording from a distance. The video had no captions, no commentary, just the image of Naomi being forced to her knees on the burning pavement, her wrists twisted behind her back, her face pressed against the blacktop, and Sheriff Briggs shouting, resisting arrest. The sound of Naomi's labored breathing, mixed with muffled cries of pain, made the clip so heavy that no one could watch it without feeling a knot form in their chest. The teen didn't use hashtags or clickbait. He simply posted, right in the middle of my town. But the video spread like dry wind hitting fire. Within less than an hour, it had been reshared thousands of times. Comments started pouring in from all over. A black woman in Atlanta wrote, I see myself in her. I was once pulled over just for driving too slow in the rain. Another account from Michigan added, every time I go grocery shopping with my son, I tell him to keep his hands out of his pockets and not to touch anything. I'm terrified the cops will look at him and see a suspect. Those posts triggered a flood of similar stories. People who had been falsely accused, had their cars searched without cause, had been called slurs. They'd never dared repeat because they thought no one would believe them. But today, when they saw Naomi forced to her knees in front of an entire neighborhood, they knew this was the moment to stop being silent. More videos began surfacing. A middle-aged woman spoke about being pulled over for driving a car too nice for her. A young man recalled being forced onto the curb for walking too close to a stop sign. A black schoolteacher described being dragged out of her car in front of her students because of a license plate scanner error. One story after another added to the rising flood of anger pouring into the news feeds. While the black community shared these painful memories, a group of conservative white residents in town responded in the opposite direction. Their comments echoed each other as if copied from the same script. The cops were doing their job. Stop blaming them. Or, if she didn't do anything wrong, Why was she arrested? One man from the suburbs wrote, "I know Briggs. He's tough but fair." Another chimed in, "People don't respect law enforcement anymore." These comments, though fewer than the tidal wave of outrage, were enough to fan the flames higher. Under one widely shared post, someone commented with clear defiance, "Same old story. Everyone jumps to defend her just because she's black." Instantly, dozens fired back. "Did you even see her in cuffs? Did you see how purple her hands were? Watch the video before you speak." But the argument didn't stop. A group of people continued defending Briggs simply because he was the town's sheriff, as if the title alone was a shield strong enough to cover every mistake. Within 2 hours, the quiet town had been split cleanly in two. One half was furious enough to talk about marching to the police station. They demanded justice for Naomi, and for everyone who had ever been treated like her. Comments like, "This can't happen again," and "It's been the same for years," filled every thread. The other half circled the wagons, acting like they were under attack. "This town has always been safe because of Briggs," they wrote. "We can't let outsiders ruin our reputation." Some even mocked the entire situation. If she didn't want trouble, she shouldn't have started it. The more people watched the video, the clearer the divide became. At the supermarket on the north side of town, two men argued. One called Briggs an abuser of power, while the other called Naomi a woman making a big deal out of nothing. At the cafe near the school, parents whispered about how kids seeing that will wonder what to think of the police. A group of teenagers in the park replayed the footage of Naomi being forced to the ground, one of them shaking his head, saying, "This is gonna blow up even more. Trust me." To 1921. Inside Naomi's home, she sat on the couch with her wrist still red. Damien held an ice pack against her arm, though his eyes kept drifting to the phone that wouldn't stop vibrating. Naomi first saw the video when her sister sent it with a message that read, "Are you okay? The whole internet's talking about you." Her heart clenched when she saw herself pinned to the pavement, Briggs's voice shouting above her like blows to her chest. But beneath the video were thousands of comments, supportive, comforting, and filled with shared real-life stories. Naomi didn't know whether to cry, or be angry, or both. But one thing was clear. What she endured today no longer belonged to her alone. It had touched the pain of thousands. It had forced the town to look at itself, and it had pushed people who once stayed silent to finally speak up. Damien looked at Naomi, his voice low but steady. Naomi gave a small nod, eyes fixed on the screen. Because every one of them has lived it, at least once in their life. Out there, the once peaceful town now trembled in the winds of outrage. One half was seeking justice. The other half was trying to protect old habits. The two sides weren't just arguing online. They were facing each other in the heart of town, under the midday sun where a black woman had been handcuffed in front of dozens of eyes, and a SEAL husband had stepped out of an SUV like a storm. And everyone understood this was only the beginning. News about the Naomi incident spread faster than anything Briggs had ever dealt with in his time as sheriff. The next morning, just as Briggs stepped into the police station parking lot, a crowd of reporters was already waiting. They stood in a line, microphones pointed at him like a firing squad. One shouted, "Sheriff Briggs, do you have anything to say about the excessive force used on a black woman?" Another chimed in, "Did you falsify the report?" Then a woman's voice added, "Witnesses say you twisted her arm until it bruised. Are you denying that?" Briggs froze, his feet refusing to move. He was used to people avoiding his gaze when they passed by. But this being surrounded by strangers with cameras, shouting into his face made Briggs feel stripped bare. He tried to take a breath and walk inside, but the questions followed him to the door. One voice yelled the final blow. "You're silent because you know you're guilty, aren't you?" Briggs pushed the door open so hard It slammed against the wall with a loud bang. Inside the station, the atmosphere was no better. Everyone he passed avoided eye contact. A few young officers standing near the coffee machine went quiet the moment he approached. One middle-aged man shook his head slightly and turned away, clearly wanting no part in it. Internal Affairs had been sending emails all night, demanding a full report by the end of the day. The head of Internal Affairs had left a short message. If you can't explain why she was injured that severely, you will be suspended. Briggs read that line 3 times and still couldn't understand how the world had turned on him so fast. He told himself, it was just a black woman disobeying orders. But for the first time in his life, that sentence sounded hollow. Because when Briggs tried to hold on to that thought, the image of Damien standing tall, the words Navy SEAL catching the sunlight, rose in his mind like a ghost. Briggs felt it in his throat. He remembered the moment his arm was twisted, when he was forced to kneel. That humiliation hadn't gone away. It sat there, warm and metallic under his skin. By noon, Briggs drove home just to avoid another round of interviews outside the station. He turned onto the main road, trying to keep the wheel steady, despite the turmoil inside. That's when it happened, a sharp crack, loud and dry like a gunshot. The car swerved hard to the right, the front end jolting so violently that Briggs had to grip the steering wheel tight to avoid hitting a nearby tree. He slammed the brakes, the car spun slightly, and the stench of burning rubber filled the air under the sun. Briggs opened the door and got out. When he looked at the front right tire, his heart dropped. The tire had blown out, the rubber torn in gaping slashes, like it had been cut with something sharp. The road was clean. No metal, no glass. This wasn't a blowout from a nail. This wasn't an accident. The cut was too precise, too clean, unlike any tire rupture Briggs had ever seen. It was a clean slice, so exact it sent a shiver down his spine. He stood there for a few seconds. Sweat slid from his temple down his neck. The lawn nearby was quiet, but his chest thumped like he was staring down the barrel of a gun. Briggs's heartbeat slowed, then sped up again, like an animal backed into a corner just realizing it has no claws left. The moment he stepped back from the tire, a thought flashed through him quick and sharp. He's warning me! Briggs wasn't a smart man, but he'd lived long enough to know how people in the shadows send messages, especially those who used to wear uniforms, the kind who knew exactly how powerful fear could be. A tire blowout wouldn't kill him, but it made him understand that if the man wanted to, worse things could happen at any moment. Briggs looked down both sides of the road. No one. No cars. The houses were still. But he felt watched. It was like someone was standing behind him, wiping down a blade. Briggs sucked in a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling. But it clung to him like a shadow that wouldn't leave, even under the sun. He muttered, "Rourke. He did this." That name, just forming in Briggs's mind, sent a chill down his spine. Briggs remembered the message. Hold her for 10 minutes. He remembered the promise from the man with the flat voice over the secure line. I'll handle the public side. You just do your part. Back then, Briggs felt bigger, stronger, chosen, and now he stood in the middle of the road with a blown-out tire, like a sign left behind to remind him he was just a pawn. And the worst part of it all, Briggs finally understood he had never really been anybody. Never been strong. Never been truly respected. The years he spent barking orders, intimidating civilians, all of it rested on nothing but a badge and the fear of others. But the man who gave him that order, Damon Rourke, didn't see him as anything more than a discarded knife. Briggs stood there, looking at the tire, his hands shaking so badly he had to lean on the car. For the first time in his life, he felt fear in its rawest form. Not fear of losing his job, not fear of the media, but fear of disappearing, like someone had already written his ending. A breeze moved through the grass nearby, but to Briggs, it sounded like footsteps. And in that moment, he understood. Every part of this, from beginning to end, every move he made, every decision he thought was his own, had just been a small piece in someone else's plan. And that someone was no longer pleased. That same evening, as the video of Naomi being pinned face down on the street spread across the internet, another video suddenly appeared. Shorter 10 seconds, but sharp enough to flip the entire debate. In this new clip, Naomi was edited to look like she yanked her arm, turned as if to resist, and jerked her head toward Briggs like she was trying to attack. The footage was blurry, but her movements were slowed down at the exact moment she lifted her head to breathe. The entire sequence was repeated twice, then zoomed in on Naomi's hand, as if to show undeniable proof. The title above the video read, "Violent Suspect Resists Police." In the first 30 minutes, most viewers didn't notice the footage had been manipulated. An anonymous account commented, "See? Told you. This attitude needs to be handled hard." Another chimed in, "Cops did the right thing. People like this always blame someone else." What followed was a stream of comments that all sounded like they came from the same voice. Just like those anti-government types. "They're always acting. Should have cuffed her from the start." These phrases rolled in, one after another, each replacing the last exactly how disinformation campaigns operate. Fast, synchronized, mindless. Naomi watched the video on her phone, and her heart sank straight into her stomach. Damien stood beside her, studying each frame. He knew this angle didn't match any of the legitimate security cameras from the store. And Naomi hadn't moved like that. She didn't jerk her head. That was the moment Briggs forced her shoulder down, making her lift her face off the pavement just to breathe. But the video had been trimmed right at the point where she raised her head, with no frames before it to show why. Just 2 seconds cut, and suddenly the victim became the attacker, and the attacker was now restoring order. "I'm Montestor." Naomi said nothing, her throat locked up. Damien placed a hand on her shoulder. "This was edited by someone who knows what they're doing," he said, voice low. "Not the kind of thing a random person would make." Naomi nodded slowly. She understood. They weren't just up against brute force. They were up against someone who knew how to weaponize information. The local media began to split into sides. A small-town station aired the 6 o'clock news, where the anchor spoke in careful tones but clearly leaned toward Briggs. "We've received a video showing the suspect resisting before being restrained." They used words like suspect, resisting, and restrained, as if Naomi had caused chaos outside the shop. The camera cut to a reporter in front of the police station, interviewing a few locals. A man said, "I don't believe the sheriff did anything wrong." A woman standing behind added, "These days, anyone can edit videos." No one asked her which video was fake, which one was real. At the same time, small local news pages were posting articles with headlines like, "We need to hear both sides of the story." Below them was the edited footage. The comment section was growing thicker by the minute. "I know that type. Acting innocent just to pounce. I saw with my own eyes she resisted the sheriff. Let the police do their job, instead of posting videos for clicks." Those comments landed on Naomi like mud. Damien watched the whole thing just to understand the scale of the issue, not because he believed it. He saw this wasn't a spontaneous reaction. This was a calculated counterattack. He looked at Naomi, his gaze sharp. "It's him," Damien said briefly. Naomi turned to him. "Damon Rourke." Damien gave a small nod. The person who faked the video, posted it online, backed it with a team of anonymous commenters, and manipulated public opinion at lightning speed, could only be someone with access to the city's security system, someone who could grab raw footage and distort it in minutes. While the town buzzed about the video, Rourke sat a few blocks away inside a room with a large window. He stood leaning against a desk, holding a cup of cold coffee, his eyes fixed on the big screen on the wall. On it was a real-time map from the town's camera system. Tiny blue dots moved slowly, the software automatically tracking pedestrians. One red dot stood out among the blue: Naomi Carter. The system had tagged her as person of interest ever since Briggs submitted his initial report. With one click, every camera around the mall would auto-track her movements. The screen next to it displayed the footage of Briggs detaining Naomi earlier that afternoon. Rourke slowed it down, rewound it, adjusted the angle, then hit publish. He didn't smile. It was impossible to tell if he was satisfied or simply watching. His face was cold, like a mask. He took a sip of the coffee, then set the cup down, his eyes on a message that popped up in a small window beside the screen. Video is spreading well. What's next? Sent an anonymous handle. Rourke typed back. Let the town split itself first. No need to act yet. Is stut. Rourke straightened up, arms folded across his chest, eyes looking down at the street where traffic was thinning. The way he was tracking Naomi wasn't like a cop investigating a case. It was like a predator watching from above, waiting for the prey to walk into exactly the spot he had planned. He knew Damien would jump in. He knew Briggs would follow the script and get it wrong. And he knew that once public opinion was torn in two, Naomi would be trapped between the accusations and the defenders, with every move she made under a microscope. Naomi stood in the living room with Damien, her phone buzzing non-stop. She read messages from friends, family, people she'd never met, and others who had once been treated like she had been that day. She could feel their anger bleeding into her, but in the middle of it all were cruel words from anonymous accounts. She deserved to be arrested, always playing the victim. The cops did nothing wrong. Damien placed a hand on Naomi's shoulder. You've made him your enemy now, he said, his voice low but firm. Naomi looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of worry and anger. And he knows every step I take. On the other side of town, Rourke watched Naomi through a thumbnail image from a corner street camera. He tilted his head slightly, like a man assessing whether the prey was reacting exactly as expected. And then he smiled, just barely. 2 days after the Naomi incident, the town of Cedar Grove was no longer the peaceful place people had once taken pride in. The main street, in front of City Hall, had suddenly become a front line. A Her Life Matters protest broke out early in the morning, and the heat over 30 degrees poured down, making the asphalt shimmer like thin mist. Still, hundreds of black residents stood in long rows, carrying signs, water bottles, and years of buried anger. A middle-aged woman held a sign that read, "I got pulled over for going the speed limit," standing next to a teenage boy, maybe 17, whose sign said, "Don't let my mom be next." The protesters weren't shouting aimlessly. They chanted in rhythm, "Her life matters." Once, then twice. Then hundreds of voices rose together like crashing waves. Leading them was an elderly woman with silver hair, a cane in hand, who had once tearfully recounted being dragged from her car by police when she was only 20. Today, she stood at the front, head high, eyes full of determination. Directly across from them, only a few meters away, stood another group in formation. They held banners reading, "Law and Order," "Support the Police," and "Stop the Chaos." Many wore shirts with flags on them, some with sunglasses and hats printed with the word USA. Their voices were loud and sharp, too. Respect the police. No disturbing the peace. Their chants mixed into the air, but clashed completely with the other side. Only a single stretch of road separated the two groups. No barricades, no police maintaining distance. Both sides stared at each other like longtime enemies, eyes filled with suspicion, fear, and unease. The heat made those feelings flare like embers catching wind. Every glance, every whisper, could be the spark. Naomi stood far from the crowd, in the safest spot Damien had chosen. She wanted to join, wanted to tell the people standing out there that she was grateful, but Damien stood right beside her, arms crossed, eyes locked on the two rising tides. "You can't go out there," he said, voice low but firm. Naomi tilted her head toward him. "I don't want to make you worry, but I can't hide forever." Damien didn't answer right away. He scanned the area, his eyes trained to read every angle. "I won't let them use you as bait between these two sides," he said. "The protest isn't the problem. The problem is the one pulling strings from the shadows." Naomi knew he meant Rourke. The thought chilled her back even in the burning heat. She swallowed. "You think he's watching?" Damien nodded slightly. "He needs this town in chaos. The more divided, the better. Easier for him to move." They both turned to the crowd. On the Her Life Matters side, an older man was speaking to a group of young people. He spoke loudly, but his voice was warm. "No one starts anything. We're here for justice, not a fight." A teenager nodded hard, but his hand gripped his sign like he might snap it in two. On the Law and Order side, a middle-aged woman yelled, "If you people followed the law, you wouldn't get arrested." The person next to her touched her shoulder. "Calm down." But she switched to a mocking tone. "You just love being victims, don't you?" Those words shot across the street like arrows. On the Her Life Matters side, a few of the young men heard it and bristled. One shouted back, "My son was only 12 when they pointed a gun at his head." "What would you know?" An older woman nodded fiercely and jumped in. "Nobody understands what it's like to have to teach your child not to put their hands in their pockets when they see a cop." N12 Verdi. Both sides began stepping forward, just half a step. The distance between them was now less than the length of two parked cars. A man on the conservative side clenched his flag, eyes locked on the boy in black, edging closer. On Naomi's side, signs were held tighter, each breath thick with anger. The heat rising from the pavement felt like fire. Damien scanned for every small sign. A clenched fist, raised shoulders, shortened breaths. To him, these weren't minor details. They were signals that a fight was about to erupt in minutes. He turned to Naomi. "Step a little farther back," he said. "If they charge at each other, you're too close here." Naomi bit her lip. "I see them standing because of me, Damien. I can't turn my back." Damien placed his hand on her shoulder, giving a light squeeze. "You're not turning your back. You're just not making yourself the spark." Before Damien could finish speaking, the shouting up front grew louder. A young man from the Her Life Matters side yelled out, "We are not criminals!" A man on the other side shouted back, "Then stop acting like it." Then something flew across the street. It wasn't clear who threw it, and landed on a woman's foot. She screamed. Every eye instantly locked onto one another. The tension was so tight, a single strong breath could snap it. Damien immediately stepped in front of Naomi, arms outstretched to block anyone who might charge. He looked left, then right, his ears catching the undercurrent of threatening whispers from both sides. He lowered his voice and said to Naomi, "When I tell you to run, you run. Don't stop. Don't look back." Naomi looked at him, her eyes wide, filled with both fear and trust. "Do you think they'll start fighting?" Damien looked at the crowd inching closer. "I think it'll only take one wrong sentence." Just one. In the middle of the street, the two groups stepped closer. A man from the conservative side shouted, "The law must be upheld." A group of young people on the other side shouted back, "Justice must be upheld." Both sides raised their voices to drown the other out. No one backed down. A young man from Her Life Matters stepped too close to the line, his eyes red with anger. Damien cursed silently. "Don't, stay back." But his voice didn't reach the man. The heat, the shouting, the hateful stares, everything merged into one heavy pressure pressing down on the street. Both sides stood locked in position, just waiting for the smallest spark. And Damien knew exactly what was waiting on the other side of this chaos. Rourke wanted the town to explode, wanted Naomi to be exposed in the mess, wanted Damien distracted. Damien stood in front of Naomi, his eyes fixed on both sides. "I can keep you safe," he said quietly. "But this town, it could break at any moment." The morning before her official testimony, Naomi sat in a small conference room at Attorney Jacobs's office. The white overhead light was so bright, it made everything feel too sharp, as if there was nowhere to hide from the memory of that day. On the table was a notebook the lawyer had given her, asking her to write down every detail. But Naomi didn't need to look at the paper. What had happened outside the boutique was etched into her like a wound that hadn't healed. Jacobs turned on the recorder, his voice deep and gentle. "Naomi, I need you to start from the moment you stepped out of the store." Naomi clenched her hands to calm herself, but when she spoke, each word felt like it bled. "I was holding the receipt. It was still warm. I had only walked a few steps when I heard the clerk scream." She paused for a beat. She wouldn't look me in the eye. She just pointed at me, like I was an object. Naomi's throat tightened as she remembered the way the townspeople looked at her that day. They stood there like I'd done something wrong. I told them I had the receipt, but they looked right through me. Jacobs wrote down every sentence. He had heard many wrongful prosecution cases, but something in the way Naomi spoke told him this wasn't just a civil rights violation. These were years of fear being let out. "Tell me what happened with Briggs," he said. Naomi exhaled hard, her eyes turning red. "He didn't ask anything. He charged at me like I was already guilty, grabbed my bag and threw it to the ground like trash. Then he twisted my arm so hard I thought I'd hear it break." Jacobs leaned in. "You remember the force clearly?" Naomi nodded. "Every bit. I heard a crack in my wrist. I didn't resist. I was just trying to breathe." When she described being forced onto the pavement, tears spilled from Naomi's eyes. "I heard people whispering. Some laughed. Some were filming. But no one spoke up for me." Jacobs handed her a box of tissues. "Naomi, you're doing well." But Naomi just shook her head. "I don't want to do well. I want that day to have happened." Damien, sitting behind her, clenched his fists. With every new detail Naomi gave, his shoulders tensed more. He had seen battlefield violence, but hearing his wife describe being humiliated in the middle of the street felt like a blade scraping through his chest. When Naomi finished her statement, Jacobs turned to Damien. "Now your turn." Damien nodded, his voice low but firm. "Damon Rourke is the man behind this." Jacobs stopped writing. "You're sure?" Damien leaned forward over the table. "He's a former SEAL. He disappeared with classified data in Syria, and now the town's security server is in his hands." Damien pulled a small USB drive from his pocket and placed it on the table. "This contains everything I kept from my unit, old messages, mission logs, and the report I wrote on Rourke when he first started changing." Jacobs opened the USB using a secure terminal. A series of files appeared on screen: brief reports, satellite photos, and encrypted mission logs. He read through them line by line, his expression growing more serious. "Damon Rourke, connected to a private security provider 6 years ago," he muttered. "Signs of system tampering, camera control, unauthorized access." Jacobs looked up. "If this data is accurate, this isn't just a case of police misconduct. This is an external force manipulating the entire system." Naomi felt a chill run down her spine. "You mean he could be watching the whole town?" Jacobs nodded. "We can't rule it out. And the edited video showing you resisting it looks a lot like AI handling." Damien jumped in. "I think he used auto-editing software. The boutique has an old analog camera system. There's no way it could have produced the fake video angle. Tout de spaz. Jacob stood and opened the door, calling to his assistant. Bring the full boutique camera data to the court's forensic team. Naomi looked after him. How will they examine it? They'll analyze the video code, Jacob said. Real footage and AI-generated footage leave different kinds of scars. If your image was faked, we'll see it. 1 hour later, in the digital forensics room of the law office, an IT specialist named Marlowe opened each file from the boutique's camera system. She rewound slowly, examining every frame. This is the original frame, Marlowe said, pointing at the screen. The boutique's camera records in a fixed position. No zoom, no auto-tracking. Damien nodded. But the fake video zooms and changes focus. Marlowe switched to the edited clip circulating online. She zoomed in on the 6th frame. Here, she said. Look. In the bottom right corner, the image edge was slightly warped. AI blurs the area around the face to blend in the movement. This isn't real footage. Naomi stared at the screen in disbelief. So they made me look like the aggressor. Marlowe turned her chair to face Naomi. Not just made you look like one. They did it professionally. This isn't the work of some amateur. Damien stood beside her. Rourke. Marlowe didn't know who Rourke was, but she looked at Damien and said, Whoever it is, they want her convicted. Naomi took a deep breath. It felt like someone was squeezing her heart. Not just the public humiliation, not just the abuse of power by the police, but now, even her dignity was being twisted by technology. When the three of them returned to Jacob's office, the attorney just sat quietly for a few seconds, looking at them. Finally, Naomi, Damien, I won't lie. This case is no longer just local, Damien asked. You think it's going federal? Jacobs nodded slowly. We've got clear signs of digital interference, abuse of the city's security system, and connections to classified information tied to a former military operative. Once I file the report, the Department of Justice may get involved. Naomi looked down at the table. Her hands were still trembling, even though Damien was holding them. I didn't want this to become something big, she whispered. Damien moved his chair closer. But you didn't choose this, Naomi. They chose you. Jacobs nodded. And now we choose how to fight back. Outside, the heat still pressed down like a weight. But inside that small office, all three of them knew what was coming. A trial that would not only determine whether Naomi was innocent or guilty, it would decide whether truth or manipulation would win. And the manipulator, Damon Rourke, had been preparing longer than anyone. Briggs had not slept for 2 nights. He lay in bed with his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling as if something were crawling across it. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of Damien twisting his wrist came back with such clarity that he could almost hear the joints tearing. Briggs sat up, over and over throughout the night, gasping like someone who had just surfaced from underwater. The pressure from the media, the pressure from the department, and Rourke's warning had mixed into something that left Briggs trembling like a man staring down the barrel of a gun. The next morning, Briggs looked at himself in the bathroom mirror at the police station. His face was haggard, and the dark circles under his eyes looked like bruises. 2 young officers walked in but immediately turned away, avoiding his face. Briggs saw it clearly, and it made him so angry that he wanted to smash the mirror that reflected his own weakness. Outside, Luke sat at his desk, hands clenched so tightly the knuckles had gone pale. His phone lay face down, because every time the screen lit up, his heart jumped. Thousands of comments on social media were calling him a co-conspirator, the guy holding a gun shaking like a rabbit, and some had even found pictures of his family to mock. At one point, Luke dropped his head onto the desk, his hair falling over half his face. How did everything end up like this? He whispered, voice drained. Briggs's office door opened, and he walked in with a face trying to appear calm, though his breathing was uneven. "Luke," Briggs said. Luke nearly jumped at the sound of his name. "In my office." Briggs closed the door behind them, then stood leaning on the desk. After a moment, he turned around. "You know how serious this is?" Luke nodded, eyes on the floor. Briggs took a breath. "If we don't act fast, the entire department could be under investigation." Luke swallowed hard. "Sheriff, I don't know what to do. They're saying my name everywhere." Briggs stepped closer and placed a hand on Luke's shoulder in a paternal gesture. "Listen to me, Luke. I have a way to fix this." Luke looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. But Briggs's gaze didn't carry comfort. It carried a calculation. "You rewrite your report," Briggs said slowly. "Say she resisted first. You can say you saw her try to pull her hand away from me." Luke froze. "But I didn't see that." Briggs looked him dead in the eye. "Luke, do you want your career to end? They'll hang you first because you're the youngest. I'm the sheriff. They won't touch me without hard evidence. But you're different." Luke stepped back half a pace. "You mean I take the fall?" Briggs gripped his shoulder harder. "Not take the fall. Just adjust the report. The court will read it and assume you followed my command. All you need to do is describe her as resisting. Say you reached for your gun because she was aggressive." Briggs leaned in, voice lower and colder. "You write that, you survive. You don't, then you already know what'll happen." Luke's expression shattered into pieces. "Sheriff, they're calling me a coward. They're making memes. My wife's been crying all night. And now you want me to lie?" Briggs snapped. "You think Rourke will let you walk away if you don't play along? You think a regular person leaked that video? No, that was him." Luke backed up another step, his hands shaking. "I don't know?" Briggs tilted his head. "I do. And you do too." The room went silent for a few seconds. Luke looked at Briggs like he no longer recognized the man standing in front of him. Briggs saw that look, but didn't care. All he could see was the only path to protect himself. Throw Luke under the bus first. "Back to your desk?" Briggs said. "Write it?" Luke walked out with legs that felt numb. Briggs closed the door, leaned back in his chair, his hands shaking so badly he had to grip the edge of the desk. He thought he was being smart, thought that pinning it on Luke would save him, thought Luke, being weak, would follow orders. What he didn't know was that the moment Luke stood from his chair, he had turned on a recording device in his pocket, an instinctive act of self-defense by someone with nowhere else to run. Back at his desk, Luke's hands still trembled, but something in his eyes had shifted. It wasn't just fear anymore. There was exhaustion, bitterness, and something that looked like defiance. He opened the report file, but didn't type a word. He stared at the screen for a long time, then shut the computer. During lunch break, Luke called his closest friend at the department, his voice small and shaking. "Bro, I got something." He sent the audio recording. On the other end, there was silence for a few seconds. Then the reply, "The sheriff really said that?" Luke nodded. "He wants me to lie, wants me to take the blame." His friend sighed. "You know, if this gets out, the whole place is going to blow up." Luke gave a tired laugh, voice raw. "It already has." End quote. When Luke ended the call, he looked around the office. The people he once called teammates avoided his eyes. No one asked if he was okay. And that was when Luke understood something Briggs still hadn't realized. Everyone in the department was trying to save themselves. No one wanted to go down with Briggs. That afternoon, the audio file was quietly sent to Internal Affairs. No sender name, no explanation. Just the sheriff's voice saying clearly, "You write that. You survive." And Luke's frightened response. A deep fracture had just opened inside the Cedar Grove Police Department. And from that moment on, Briggs no longer knew that he had already lost the only thing that could have saved him loyalty from those beneath him. That morning, the state court's digital forensics lab lit up earlier than usual. On the table was a hard drive containing all data from the boutique's camera, with original files separated minute by minute. Naomi and Damien were invited to sit in the back row. Neither of them spoke, but Damien rested his hand on the back of Naomi's chair, staying close enough to protect, yet far enough not to pressure her. The lead forensic technician was Marlowe, the same one who had reviewed the data the day before. But today, seated beside her was an independent expert from the court. He opened each file, zoomed into each pixel cluster, and advanced through every frame. Frame, second 7, he said, eyes fixed on the screen. Zoom into the upper left corner. Marlowe enlarged the image. A strange, blurred patch appeared. You see that ripple, she said. The boutique camera is analog. It doesn't produce AI compression edge artifacts like this. The expert nodded and added, more than that. The frame rate in the segment where Naomi was allegedly stealing is abnormally high. This is artificial frame boosting. This camera isn't capable of that. Naomi clenched her jaw lightly. Damien leaned closer to her and said softly, don't hold it in. Everything's getting clearer. About an hour later, the technicians recovered a section of overwritten footage. It was another video layer blurry, with the top half obscured but still clear enough to show the truth. Naomi didn't put anything into her bag. She was simply reaching for a receipt, then slinging her purse strap over her shoulder. No sneaky movement, no leaning, no turning away. Nothing matched the cut and edited video that had gone viral. Marlowe rewound and zoomed in on the frame where Naomi grabbed the receipt. This, she said, is just a normal customer action. The forensic expert tapped the desk. So where did the incriminating video come from? Marlowe opened a file located in the boutique's secondary system. Someone had to access the back end. The boutique uses a rented security system from a private firm. Here, look at the logo. She pointed to the top right corner of the screen, where a faint symbol appeared. RSS Rourke Security Systems. Damien tightened his grip on the chair arm. Naomi took a sharp breath. Rourke, she said under her breath. That name made the entire room fall silent for a few seconds. The expert stepped closer to the screen, squinting. If the boutique's security system runs through RSS servers, it's possible they had the ability to edit the footage before it was uploaded to the cloud. Jacobs, Naomi's lawyer, standing in the back, caught it all. You're saying they had the means to fabricate evidence? Not just the means, the expert replied. They did it. The signs are clear. The original and fake videos don't share the same timecode or bitrate. Jacobs let out a long breath, but it wasn't a sigh of defeat. It was the breath of someone who had finally found solid ground after falling endlessly. He turned to Naomi. You're not just innocent, he said. You're a victim of technical manipulation. Naomi lowered her head, her eyes burning red. But this time, not from shame. It was the confirmation that she hadn't imagined it. What she endured wasn't something everyone goes through. It was a deliberate strike. As the forensic team continued digging, a server log file unexpectedly surfaced. A faint line read, Override, DR77. Marlowe frowned. I haven't seen that code before. The expert flipped quickly through his documents. DR could be an engineer's initials. No. Damien cut in, his voice firm. It stands for Damon Rourke. Both technicians turned sharply. You're sure? Damien nodded. 77 is the unit he used to run in Black Ops. He tags it in all his tech documentation. The expert quickly jotted that down, then said to Jacobs, I'll present this to the court. It's proof that the system was accessed by someone with the highest level credentials. Hearing that, Naomi covered her mouth with her hand. He really came after me. Her voice shook, but didn't break. Damien placed his hand gently on top of hers. Not just you. He's using you to hide something else. It's not as Buthers. A few hours later, when the forensic report was completed, the state court issued an emergency order. A legal clerk entered the waiting room and handed an envelope to Jacobs. The court has called for a formal hearing, he said, including the Naomi Carter case and the investigation into RSS's security system tampering. Jacobs opened the envelope, scanned it, then turned to the couple. The day after tomorrow, he said. They'll review both Briggs's conduct and the origin of the fake video. Unquote. Naomi felt the pressure in her chest shift. Not lighter, but no longer crushing. The court? Believes me? She asked. Jacobs nodded slowly. The court believes the evidence, and the evidence is on your side. Damien looked at the document in Jacobs's hand and took a deep breath. And Rourke? Jacobs folded the envelope. If the court wants the origin of the fake video, he'll be named in the record. Unquote. Naomi looked out the conference room window. The sky outside was calm, but inside her, waves were rising stronger by the minute. If he could manipulate the boutique, she said quietly, he could manipulate the whole town. Damien squeezed her shoulder. That's why we bring the truth back to ground before he drags everything into the mud. In that moment, Naomi knew they had crossed into a new phase. This was no longer just her fight. No longer just Briggs's story. This was a battle against the invisible hand of Damon Rourke. The courtroom of Cedar Grove County was packed since morning. Outside, protesters from both sides stood in rows, but inside the courthouse, all noise was held back behind the heavy wooden doors. Naomi sat in the front row, her hands clasped together, her palms damp with sweat. Damien sat directly behind her, his eyes locked on every movement in the room. Across from them, Briggs was led in, wearing his police uniform neatly. But his face was so exhausted, he looked like he hadn't slept in a month. The judge entered. The room fell silent, as if the sound had been cut. The hearing on Briggs and the incident involving Naomi Carter is now in session. The judge's voice was firm, each word echoing clearly in the tense atmosphere. The prosecutor stood up first, extending a hand toward Briggs. Sheriff Briggs, would you like to say anything before we present the evidence? Briggs took a deep breath, if trying to swallow something stuck in his throat. I followed procedure, he said, his voice trying to stay calm. She resisted. I had to control the situation. A ripple of quiet murmurs ran through the black community seated behind Naomi. The prosecutor squinted. You are stating that Naomi Carter resisted. Briggs gave a slight nod. Correct. End quote. We'll examine that testimony, the prosecutor said, then turned to the judge. Naomi stood up. Her legs trembled slightly, but she walked straight to the stand. When she reached the witness box and raised her hand for the oath, the entire courtroom held its breath. Naomi, the prosecutor began, please tell the court exactly what happened. Naomi gripped the edge of the stand tightly, trying to keep her voice steady. I walked out of the store with my receipt. I had only taken a few steps. She looked straight at the judge. I heard the employee scream that I stole something. I held up the receipt, but no one looked. They looked at me like I was already guilty. A heavy breath spread through the courtroom. Naomi swallowed hard and went on. Sheriff Briggs arrived. He didn't ask anything. He grabbed my bag and threw it to the ground. He twisted my arm. Naomi raised her wrist, where the bruises still lingered in patches. I didn't fight back. I was just trying to breathe. On Briggs's side, a young officer turned to look at him, eyes full of disbelief. Briggs stared at the floor, lips tightly pressed. Naomi continued, each sentence dropping like a weight on the tiled floor. He forced my face down onto the street. People stood around watching. Some laughed. Some filmed. and I felt like I wasn't human anymore. Is 7. A woman in the row behind raised her hand to cover her mouth, her eyes growing wet. The judge tilted their head, listening closely to every word. The prosecutor nodded. Thank you, Naomi. Then he turned to the other side of the room, voice rising with strength. Now, I call our second witness, Damian Carter. Damian stood and walked to the stand with a calm that made both sides of the courtroom stop and watch. He stood tall, both hands placed in front of him, eyes on the judge. Mr. Damian, the prosecutor asked, what did you witness when you arrived on the scene? Damian looked directly ahead, his voice low, not loud but carrying force with each word. I saw my wife being pinned to the ground, her arm twisted behind her. Her belongings were thrown to the pavement, and Briggs was standing over her like she was something he could use to show off his power. Briggs winced and looked like he was about to object, but the judge raised a hand to signal silence. Damian continued, what I saw wasn't control. It was humiliation. His voice was so steady the courtroom stopped breathing. It was the action of someone who thinks they have the right to do anything they want to another person's body, just because that person is black. Many people in the room bowed their heads when they heard that. A man in the back whispered to his wife. The prosecutor flipped through his papers. Thank you, Mr. Damian. Then he turned back to Briggs. Sheriff Briggs, do you have anything to rebut? Briggs shot to his feet, the veins in his neck bulging. She resisted. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. You're certain? Yes, Briggs snapped. I saw her pull her hand away. Based on which video? Briggs froze. The entire courtroom turned to look at him. The prosecutor held up a laptop. The original video shows that Naomi did not place anything in her bag. No jerking away. No resistance. Briggs's face went pale. I received orders to detain her. The prosecutor stepped forward. Orders from whom? Sweat broke out on Briggs's forehead. I can't say. You can, the prosecutor replied. And you must. Briggs looked around, his eyes locking onto Naomi, then shifting to Damian, then retreating toward the prosecutor, as if there were nowhere left to go. He swallowed hard, his throat dry and raspy. I was following orders, Briggs said, his voice so low that people had to hold their breath to hear. Orders from a unit? That doesn't exist on paper. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The prosecutor froze. What unit? Briggs visibly shook. They told me to arrest her. Hold her for 10 minutes. I don't know who they are. I just followed the instructions that came through the system. Naomi clenched her fists. Her heart skipped a beat. Damian stared straight at Briggs, his eyes darkening, but he said nothing. The prosecutor stood silent for a few seconds, then spoke, slow and clear. Your Honor, this testimony opens up a much larger issue. The judge tapped the gavel lightly. Enter it into the record. In that moment, the courtroom in Cedar Grove was no longer just a place to judge a police officer's abuse of power. It became the place where a door cracked open onto something deeper in the dark. An unnamed unit. A secret order. A hidden hand behind it all. Everyone in the room understood. The Naomi Carter case was only the surface, and the shadow behind Briggs' ad now stepped into the light. The verdict was delivered late in the afternoon, as the sun tilted low and cast a harsh yellow light across the courtroom. The judge struck the gavel and spoke firmly. Sheriff Briggs is found guilty of abuse of power, excessive use of force, falsifying official records, and obstruction of civil rights. A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Briggs stood frozen, his eyes wide as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. He turned to look for support from the row of officers behind him, but not a single one met his gaze. While Briggs was still stunned, 2 internal affairs officers stepped forward and placed their hands on his shoulders. Mr. Briggs, You are under arrest. Briggs jerked backward. No, I was following orders. But the sentence was cut short by the click of the handcuffs around his wrists. The sound was dry, heavy, and no one in the room felt sorry. Luke shot up from his seat as if pricked by a needle. His face drained of color when he saw Briggs handcuffed in the middle of the courtroom. But before he could react, 2 other internal affairs agents approached him. Deputy Luke, one of them said clearly, you are under arrest for perjury and conspiracy. Luke opened his mouth. I didn't. The agent held up a phone and played the recording of Briggs coercing Luke into falsifying the report. Briggs's voice echoed through the courtroom like metal hitting the floor. Luke fell silent, his shoulders sagging. The handcuffs snapped onto his wrists just as the recording ended. No one from the department stood up for him. No one said a word. Naomi watched the scene with a heavy heart. Even though Luke had played a role in her pain, seeing him dragged into the darkness Briggs created stirred a strange sadness in her. But Damien placed his hand on the back of her chair and said in a low voice, You don't have to carry that. Everyone chose their own path. Naomi gave a small nod. The atmosphere in the courtroom had just begun to shift from tense to relieved when the doors at the back swung open. A court staffer rushed in and handed a file to the prosecutor. He spoke just one line, Urgent update. The prosecutor frowned and scanned the pages quickly. Then his expression changed. He looked up at the judge. Your Honor, we've just received a countersuit from outside the county. It accuses Naomi Carter of involvement in the theft of classified military data. The courtroom felt as if the air had been sucked out. Naomi shot up from her seat. What? Her voice broke into a near scream. Damien stepped in front of her immediately, his eyes darkening. The prosecutor continued reading, trying to keep his tone steady. The plaintiff is Damon Rourke, representing the security firm RSS 8012. Jacobs jumped to his feet. A countersuit at the very moment Briggs is convicted? He thinks anyone will believe this? The judge banged the gavel for order. But there was no containing the chaos. Some people from the conservative white community smiled as they'd just been handed new ammunition. Several from the Her Life Matters group shouted in protest. Naomi felt her knees weaken, but Damien caught her. I didn't do anything, Naomi said, her voice trembling with fury and fear. I don't even know what data they're talking about. Jacobs tried to calm her. You don't have to prove anything right now. But his eyes were full of concern. Rourke is pulling this move to change the game. He wants you pulled into a federal investigation. As the hearing adjourned, Naomi had just reached the courthouse steps when Damien grabbed her arm. Naomi didn't have time to ask why. A black SUV they didn't recognize rolled slowly past. Inside were 2 men in dark suits, wearing sunglasses even in the fading daylight. They turned and stared directly at Naomi as the vehicle glided away. Naomi shivered. Did you see that? Damien pulled her closer, his expression turning sharp. They're not local law enforcement. Jacobs ran up, urgency in his voice. I just heard from a contact in the federal court. Unidentified agents were asking about Naomi in the hallway. Naomi blinked in disbelief. Asking about me? Jacobs nodded. They didn't say which agency. Damien stood still, like he'd been struck by lightning. He turned to Jacobs, his voice dropping into something cold and dangerous. Rourke is pulling them in. He wants Naomi isolated. Once she's considered a national security threat, her civil protections mean nothing. Naomi clutched Damien's arm as she needed it to stay upright. Damien, this is bigger than me now. Damien kept his eyes locked on the street. A familiar feeling crept up his spine. One he had tried to leave behind when he left the SEALs. That sharp, cold steel of thought. His phone buzzed hard in his pocket. Damien pulled it out. The screen showed only one message, no sender name. A short line, Protocol 77 reactivated. Goosebumps spread from the back of Damien's neck, down his spine. His lips tightened into a straight line. Naomi looked at his face and immediately saw the change. "What is it?" Damien didn't answer right away. He swallowed, eyes still on the distant figures near the black SUV. "Naomi, Protocol 77 is something I hoped I'd never hear again." Naomi placed her hand on his chest. "What is it?" Damien looked deep into her eyes. "It's a signal to reactivate a unit that was erased from all records. The unit Rourke used to command." Naomi sucked in a breath, her heart pounding. Damien closed his phone, gripped Naomi's hand tightly, and spoke in a voice low as a blade. "Rourke just declared war, and from that moment they both knew. The Naomi case was no longer a debate about race or police brutality. It had become a battle between two former SEALs. One, protecting the truth. One is manipulating the shadows. The evening wind swept across the courthouse steps, carrying the leftover heat of a day packed with anger and fear. Naomi stood close beside Damien, her hand still in his, but her palm trembled with each faint pulse. The crowd outside had mostly thinned, but the silence around them was stretched tight like wire. Damien kept his eyes on the road leading out of town, watching every unfamiliar car creeping by like it was scanning the scene. Naomi noticed the tension in his shoulders, something about it sharper than usual. Just like that first afternoon he came home from a mission too long to talk about. "Damien," she whispered, but he didn't turn right away. Only when she squeezed his hand tighter did he finally look down. On Damien's left wrist, just below the raised vein, a faded mark she had always thought was an old scar suddenly lit up with a cold blue glow. It didn't shine like a lamp. It glowed like something pulsing beneath his skin. The mark spread into a curved shape, forming a symbol Naomi had never seen before. It looked like some kind of identification code, something not meant for regular eyes. Naomi took half a step back, her heart thudding. "Damien, what is that?" Her voice came out like a short breath, caught between fear and confusion. Damien looked down at his wrist, then clenched his hand as if to hide the mark, but it kept glowing, pulsing lightly. He drew in a deep breath, heavy as stone. "I thought it was gone," he said quietly. "I thought it was erased along with the rest of that unit." "What unit?" Naomi asked, her voice low but laced with uncertainty. Damien stared at her for a long time, his eyes filled with pain and resolve. "Naomi, this isn't a tattoo. It's an ID mark for a Black Ops team in SEAL. It only lights up when an old protocol is reactivated. Protocol 77 isn't a message. It's a recall signal for anyone who was ever part of that unit." Naomi felt her blood go cold. "You mean they want you to go back?" Damien shook his head. "No, I mean, they're hunting us." On a hill near the outskirts of Cedar Grove, where darkness had settled in completely, a man stood at the ridge, holding a small, rectangular tracking device in his hand. The screen blinked with glowing dots and jagged waves. The wind whipped through his coat, but his face didn't flinch. No one knew what agency he belonged to. No badge, no uniform, just eyes cold, deep, and expressionless, like black water. The device vibrated. A red dot pulsed brighter in the dark. He spoke a dry sentence into his earpiece. "Target confirmed. Naomi Carter." At the bottom of the hill, SUV headlights blinked on one after another. Several dark vehicles roared to life at once, engines growling in low rhythm like war drums starting a chase. The man folded the device, slipped it into his pocket, and walked down the trail without turning on a light. He knew the way, as if he had been here many times before. Naomi felt something shift outside the courthouse. An invisible pressure, like the air had compressed just slightly, as if someone was watching from uncomfortably close. She gripped Damien's hand. "Damien, they're coming." He placed a hand on her waist, pulling her closer, his eyes razor-sharp. "I know." Naomi had never seen that look before. It wasn't the look of the gentle husband who shielded her from every storm. This was the gaze of someone who had lived where laws did not reach, where right and wrong were decided by speed and instinct. The look of a soldier being pulled back into a war he had tried to leave behind. "Damien," Naomi said softly, her voice shaking, "I don't want you to go back to that life." He pressed his forehead to hers for a brief second, just to hear each other breathe. "I'm not going back," Damien said. "I'm fighting for you, and for the truth they're trying to bury." A distant car horn echoed, quiet but strange. Damien snapped his head toward the parking lot, eyes narrowing. "We have to go. Right now." Naomi nodded. But before they moved, Damien gripped her hand once more. He looked at her with complete certainty, as if trying to etch his words into her bones. "Naomi," he said, slow and clear, "justice is just the beginning." He looked toward the deepening shadows at the end of the road. "This is where the real fight begins." And as the two of them stepped off the courthouse steps, their shadows stretched across the pavement, while behind them, the dark SUVs began forming into formation. The hunt had truly begun.